Hi guys, this revision lesson is on the impact of the 1832 Reform Act. Before you listen to it, make sure you listen to the reasons why the 1832 Reform Act actually passed. I wanted to start off with a quote from Scott Bauman, who's a historian, and he kind of gives us a good insight into what the kind of message of this revision session is going to be. So he says the details of the bill were perhaps less important than the fact and manner of its passing. And what he's referring to here is the fact that the passing of the 1832 Reform Act involved some very significant power shifts. So the fact that a government with a parliamentary majority defeated the power of the Crown and the power of the House of Lords in order to pass a bill that had the support of the general population was highly significant because it represented what had been traditionally the most powerful forces of government in terms of the aristocracy and the monarchy backing down in the face of the power of public opinion and the electorate. So in many ways, the fact that the 1832 Reform Act passed and the way that it passed is more significant than what the bill actually included. But we're going to look at the impact of the 1832 Reform Act in 5 different areas. The first is the kind of the practical changes that took place, so the actual changes to the franchise and the redistribution of seats. We're then going to look at the impact of the 1832 Reform Act and the power of the monarch, the impact on the power of the aristocracy, and the impact on party organisation. In terms of the way that essays are worded for the breadth topic, which is the one that we're looking at now, you tend to get questions that ask you the extent to which changes to the franchise affected these 3. Or the extent to which redistribution of seats affected these bottom 3. You could also get a question on the extent to which the power of the monarch or aristocracy or parties transformed. So you either have to analyse why change happened by linking to changes to the franchise and redistribution of seats, or you need to analyse the extent of change. So this video should help you with both of those things. The first change you need to know about is the changes to the franchise that occurred as a result of the Act. The franchise increased by 60%, so it was a considerable increase, but nowhere near as significant in the increase as the 1867 Reform Act, when the franchise doubled. Following the 1832 Reform Act, 1 in 7 men had the right to vote. So still a relatively small proportion. In a percentage, that's about 15% of the male population could vote. The way that people qualified to vote after the 1832 Reform Act was different. So, for example, the word male was added to the Act. For the first time in Britain, then, the electorate was entirely male. So whereas before, some female landowners, particularly widows or daughters who'd inherited their father's land, they had previously been able to vote, but they no longer could do following the 1832 Reform Act. So you had to be a man. If you lived in a borough, you had to own or rent property worth £10 per year. Anyone who could afford £10 rent a year was likely to be from the middle class. If you're from the middle class, that means that you would be, rather than getting weekly wages, you'd be paid for your services, and that would be intellectual labour rather than manual labour. So whereas before the 1832 Reform Act, there was the kind of divide between the working class and middle class was quite loosely defined. After the 1832 Reform Act, there was this clear political distinction. So changes to the franchise, one of the impacts of this was that there was the sort of loose political partnership that had existed between the middle and working class before 1832 disappeared, and what existed instead was this sort of partnership of the propertied classes who had the vote, in contrast to the non-propertied classes who didn't. So that's what existed in the boroughs. In the counties, it was slightly different. The 40 shilling freeholder franchise remained. So if you owned property worth 40 shillings, then you had the vote. But in addition to this were added those voters who were tenants who owned or who rented £50 worth of land, or who paid £50 for their land per year. Now these would be very wealthy tenants. This addition to the Reform Act was known as the Chandos Clause because it was introduced by a guy called Chandos, and the idea was to make the 1832 Reform Act even more aristocratic, because it was known that the aristocracy found it easier to influence elections in counties because of the kind of deference that was paid to them in rural seats. So this actually, although it added more people to the vote, in many ways it made the electorate more conservative. So in terms of changes to the franchise, the main things you need to know is just what they were, but you also need to be able to explain what the impact of the changes to the franchise were, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But first of all, we need to look at the changes to the redistribution of seats. So I think with the redistribution of seats, it's worth dividing the change into what was lost, what was gained, and what remained the same. So let's start with what was lost. A major change that made the post-1832 franchise more representative was the disenfranchisement, it's a difficult word to say, of 56 rotten boroughs. And not only that, but on top of the 56 boroughs losing both their MPs, some smaller boroughs also lost one MP. This meant that the post-1832 political system was certainly less corrupt than it had been previously. However, there were still some issues. I'll come on to those in a second, but first of all, let's think about what was actually gained. So most of the changes that were made in 1832 were designed to appease those middle class campaigners, like those that had been members of the Birmingham Political Union, by sort of rebalancing constituencies so that industrial towns had more representation than they had done previously. So 22 large towns were enfranchised. Those included towns like Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester, and that was a significant gain for the industrial middle class. However, this was counteracted, or the way that the aristocracy saw it is this was counteracted by 67 new county seats. So a lot of the seats that were lost from the rotten and smaller boroughs were given to counties. So from 1832 onwards, there were actually a higher proportion of MPs representing counties than there were representing boroughs. Now, the aim here was that the aristocracy would almost pen in the urban voters into these kind of borough seats, and accepted that those voters would be more difficult for them to influence. But by removing those voters from counties like Yorkshire, so say the voters of Leeds would now no longer vote in the Yorkshire county election, that meant that it was even easier for the aristocracy to influence who would be elected within the counties. So although this seemed like a positive change, and it was in a way, the creation of these 67 new county seats meant that the aristocracy were able to keep a very strong influence over the electorate, or over elections rather. And so as well, alongside these changes, a number of things remained. There were still 31 boroughs with fewer than 300 voters. These were essentially pocket boroughs still, and they were pretty much controlled by different members of the aristocracy. And remember that within each borough, there were normally 2 MPs. So that meant there were 60 seats that could be controlled by members of the aristocracy. An example of one of these is Newark, which remained pretty much gifted to his MP of choice by the Duke of Newcastle. And also, as I've just mentioned, what remained was an over-representation of the rural south, and these are county seats. There were smaller counties in the south, and so the south was overrepresented in comparison to the north, and counties or rural areas continued to be overrepresented in comparison to industrial areas. So again, with redistribution of seats, you need to know what the actual redistribution was, but the main thing you need to be able to explain is what impact this had. And we're going to look at now what the impact of redistribution and extension of the franchise was on the monarchy, on the aristocracy, and on political parties. The most dramatic shift in terms of power following 1832 was the shift away from the monarchy. The picture here shows William IV. He had been king for a relatively short amount of time. He'd never been expected to be king, and he was generally seen to be fairly unprepared for this role. And that was only proven by his response to the 1830 crisis and also his kind of actions afterwards. And the really important thing that happened during the passing of the Reform Act was that for the first time, the monarch came up against the kind of overwhelming strength of public opinion, the electorate, and the Commons. And for the first time, the monarch kind of came up against these three, and that they were united in aiming for the same thing. So Grey, as Whig Prime Minister, had a majority in the Commons. He was supported by the electorate, which, remember, at this time was only about 5% of the population, and the electorate was supported by public opinion. What William IV found is that when those elements were united, he did not have the strength to resist those elements. And obviously he sort of expected to be supported by the House of Lords in this, and initially was. But what he eventually found is that he was forced to back down and threaten to create more Whig peers in order to allow the Reform Bill to pass. And that was the first time in history that the monarch had been forced to agree to create more peers in order to get through a piece of legislation that was supported by a majority government in the House of Commons. So this was incredibly important because the monarch had never really backed down in the face of a majority before. And this established a precedent because from the 1832 Reform Act onwards, it became very, very difficult for the monarch to have any influence over a government with a majority in the House of Commons. And we can see that if we look through the rest of the 1830s, because both William IV and Victoria failed to influence governments in the rest of that decade. So this is reflected in Peel's first 100 days as Prime Minister, which started in 1834. And when William IV invited Peel to form a minority government, Peel was quite clear with William that that was only possible if Peel was going to have an election, because he needed to increase or improve the number of MPs that he had supporting him in the Commons. Now, the very fact that Peel felt that he could not rule purely with the support of the monarch shows that by 1834, the situation was significantly different to how it had been in the late 18th century, because when Pitt was chosen by the monarch to be Prime Minister, although he only had a relatively small amount of support in the House of Commons, Pitt did not feel the need to call an election. But Peel called the election. He then takes the election incredibly seriously. So he writes effectively the first ever political manifesto, which is supposedly as a letter to his constituency of Tamworth. But in reality, what it is, it's an attempt to win over the national electorate to vote for his party. And so clearly Peel was taking this election very seriously. And that already tells us that winning a majority in an election has become far more important. When Peel gets the results of the election, he does very well. He significantly adds to the number of Tory seats in the House of Commons, but he does not have enough to form a majority, and therefore he takes the decision to resign. And that demonstrates to William that he no longer can influence the House of Commons to support his chosen candidate. Instead, it's going to be the electorate, which has now obviously grown significantly to around 15% of the population. the electorate, 15% of the male population, I should say, the electorate are now going to be the ones that determine who the Commons supports, and that the monarch cannot support a prime minister if that prime minister does not have the support of the Commons. So that is the first event that shows how much the power of the monarch has reduced. And then the second event is in 1839, when the new Queen Victoria, attempts to prevent a Tory government from forming when she refuses to appoint Conservative ladies to her household, and she hopes this will allow her to keep Melbourne as her Prime Minister. It works in the short term, but it is an incredibly unpopular move, and by 1841 the Conservatives win an overwhelming majority, and from 1840 onwards Queen Victoria never tries to influence who forms a government. Instead, she just invites the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons to form a government. So it is clear that by the end of the 1830s, a precedent has been established. By 1840, the precedent has been established that the role of the monarch is this, that the monarch has the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn, but no right to choose ministers. That is determined by elections. No right to affect policy. That is determined by who has the majority in the House of Commons. So clearly, the 1832 Reform Act had a transformative effect on the power of the monarch. Although the power of the monarch was decreasing before 1832 as sinecures and pensions were removed, but at the beginning of 1830, the monarch was still the most powerful individual in the British political system, and by the passing of the 1832 Reform Act, that was no longer the case. When we look at the influence that the 1832 Reform Act had on the power of the aristocracy, what we get is a picture of, in the short term, the aristocracy actually being strengthened and their hold over government and the political system being strengthened. But in the longer term, the kind of seeds being sown for the potential for the influence of the aristocracy to be reduced. So if we look at why aristocratic power was strengthened initially, one of the fears of the 1832 Reform Act was that there would be this influx of middle-class MPs and that the House of Commons would no longer represent the landed class. That was one of the fears of the aristocracy. But actually that didn't happen. If we look at the 1841 election, 1 out of 5 MPs was middle class, so about 20%. And the rest of the House of Commons remained from a landed background, whether that was related to peers or members of the agricultural or members of the rural gentry. So the people within the House of Commons itself remained from the landed class. Obviously, you couldn't be actually aristocratic if you were in the House of Commons, but you were often related to the aristocracy, and you represented their interests, because if you're a rural landowner, your money comes from collecting rents, just in the same way that the aristocrats collected money that way as well. In addition, as we saw earlier, there were 60 seats at least that were pretty much controlled by individual members of the aristocracy. The example I gave before was the Duke of Newcastle's hold over the constituency of Newark. In addition, the fact that there were an increase in the number of county constituencies worked in the aristocracy's favour, because voters in the counties almost always voted deferentially, in that they voted for the candidate that was preferred by the local member of the aristocracy. So that allowed the aristocracy to continue to wield a huge influence over the outcome of elections, whether that was in choosing a candidate that would stand in a borough or a county, whether it was supporting them financially, because there was still no secret ballot, so bribery continued. Whatever it was, the aristocracy was able to influence wield a huge influence over the outcome of elections, and the number of contested seats in the years after 1832 remained incredibly low. The majority of seats remained uncontested in each election. So a very strong aristocratic influence over the people that sat in the House of Commons. In addition, the aristocracy continued to dominate governments. So the only prime minister between 1832 and 1860 that was not a member of the aristocracy was Peel. And the people who were ministers continued to be almost entirely from aristocratic backgrounds. That continues right up until the end of the century. So clearly the aristocratic influence remains incredibly strong. One of the reasons why there is not an influx of middle class MPs is that the middle class kind of, as Grey promises they will, there's kind of this gratitude towards the aristocracy, and the middle class accept the old aristocratic parties, they accept aristocratic leadership, almost forming a partnership with the aristocracy, that partnership of the property classes that I mentioned earlier. And so rather than trying to replace the aristocracy and create a middle class government and middle class political system, the middle class were prepared to play a part in it, but not try and kind of subvert it. And in many ways that made the aristocracy more powerful, because the aristocratic government, and government remained aristocratic after 1832, that aristocratic government gained legitimacy and the support of the middle class people who had previously been campaigning for reform. If you think about the Birmingham Political Union, I've just put a picture on your screen here of one of the BPU meetings, which had 200,000 people at this meeting. The people on the podium here was, that's Thomas Attwood speaking there, and the people behind him are his middle class allies. Many of them were from the banking or manufacturing backgrounds. These were people who, when they worked with the working class, were very threatening. But when they added their support to the aristocracy, they actually bolstered the strength of the government significantly. And that's why the government is able to respond so strongly to movements like the Chartist movement. Whereas in 1831, they have to move quite carefully. The government knew it lacked legitimacy in 1831. By 1839, 1842, the government can act with confidence, knowing that they've got the support of this powerful manufacturing group, powerful middle-class voters. So initially, the power of the aristocracy is strengthened, or at least it is, secured. It seems like the aristocrats have been strengthened by the 1832 Reform Act, and Grey promises that there will not be a further reform. John Russell, who was the leader of the Whigs in the House of Commons, gets the nickname Finality Jack because he makes a speech in the Commons saying that this will be the last ever reform to the British political system. But Robert Peel, the leader of the newly formed Conservative Party, is a bit more astute than that, and he makes the prediction that actually reform and further reform of the political system is inevitable, and he obviously turns out to be correct. And the seeds for future reform and future reductions in the power of the aristocracy are sown not in the nature of the Reform Act itself, but in the fact that the Reform Act passed and in the way that it passed. If we think about the political system before 1832, it tended to look like this. So you've got this combined power of the House of Lords, the House of Commons and the electorate, and their aims were pretty much almost always the same, because they were all members of the landed class. They were all interested in retaining the status quo because it put them in a really powerful position. They collectively supported the monarch, and therefore in return the monarch sort of supported them. At the same time, they didn't have to worry too much about public opinion, because public opinion was very weak in the face of this very powerful alliance of members of the landed class. And so in 1832, the aristocracy, the House of Commons and the electorate effectively had the same interests. However, if we look at the way that the 1832 Reform Act passed, what we find is that the House of Lords found itself in opposition, along with the monarch, in opposition to the Commons, public opinion and the electorate. And whereas the House of Lords was fairly confident that in the face of a pro-reform Commons public opinion and electorate, that they would overcome and the House of Lords would kind of win that battle, what they found by the end of 1832 is, in fact, they had lost, that the monarch had been forced to work with the Commons, and that the monarch had threatened the House of Lords that more peers would be made, and that the House of Lords therefore had to back down. So the House of Lords actually learnt an important lesson here, and that was that when the government had the backing of the electorate, had a majority in the House of Commons, the government could force the House of Lords to back down. Now, this became even more influential when, after 1832, the electorate was no longer 3 to 5% of the population. The electorate was 1 in 7 adult males. And that 1 in 7 didn't just include members of the landed class whose interests would be fairly similar to the House of Lords. It included members of the middle class that would have very different interests to the House of Lords. And many members of those middle class saw the aristocracy as a backwards and kind of corrupt class. So post-1832, the situation is quite different. We can pretty much remove the monarch from the picture. And what we have is the electorate, which is voting for the Commons, which is often supported by public opinion, not always. If you look at Chartism, we've got a large proportion of the public going against the House of Commons, but often supported by public opinion. I'll put that down there. And that is coming up against the House of Lords. Now, a lot of the time, the House of Lords and the Commons and the electorate had similar interests. But increasingly, as the century went on, the House of Commons and the electorate ended up having different interests to the House of Lords. And what happened in 1832 is a precedent was set that when the electorate and the House of Commons were united, the House of Lords would back down. Now, obviously, from 1832 onwards, aristocratic influence over the House of Commons was very strong. But as that starts to change in 1867, 1872, 1884, and the House of Lords can no longer influence who's in the Commons, it becomes more and more likely that the House of Commons and the House of Lords will come up against each other. And what happens in 1832 is the seeds are sort of sown for a political system in which the House of Commons is much more powerful than the House of Lords. And if the Commons is going to be more powerful than the House of Lords, then eventually the power of the aristocracy is going to decline. So hopefully what you can see there is that the 1832 Reform Act initially strengthens the House of Commons, but initially strengthens the aristocracy, but lays the foundations for the future weakening of the aristocracy as it confirmed the power of the House of Commons over that of the House of Lords. An historian who puts that across really well is a guy called Michael Smith, and he says that the House of Commons exerted an influence over the upper house and the monarchy that made it the most powerful branch of government in the 19th century. And that picture in which the House of Commons was able to exert this influence over the House of Lords and the monarchy was established in 1832. So that covers the impact of the power of the aristocracy. Another reason why the power of the aristocracy was sort of destined to decline after 1832 is that the 1832 Reform Act had a huge impact on party organisation. Before 1832, the most significant influencer of the membership of the House of Commons was without doubt the aristocracy. But from 1832, the influence of parties over the makeup of the House of Commons grows and grows. And the importance of party rivalry becomes more significant than the importance of aristocratic support. So we're going to look at the impact of the 1832 Reform Act on party organisation now. When it came to political parties, 1832 meant two things. First of all, the importance of a majority in the House of Commons increased significantly. The support of the monarch was no longer as important as as having a majority in the House of Commons. From 1832 onwards, it was established practice that if you lost a major vote in the House of Commons, you would resign and your government would no longer exist. So the majority was far more important than it had been before. And in addition, the 1832 Reform Act required that all voters would register. So when you take these two things together, what this means is it's more important for MPs to work together in order to ensure a majority. And the most natural way to work together was in a political party. And it's more important for the party to appeal to voters for two reasons. One, because the voters need to register, so the parties need to go out and persuade them to do that. And two, because if an election is lost, your party is no longer going to be able to be in power. So both of those things are going to have a huge impact on party organisation. And so whereas before 1832, political parties were relatively loose groupings, like unofficial groups of MPs who had vaguely the same political ideas, after 1832, they become disciplined groups of MPs who agree to work together to form majorities and to agree to fight elections together. And a crucial part of fighting elections is persuading voters to register. So the different parties respond differently to these new challenges. The Tories immediately form the Carlton Club, which was a private members' club for Conservative MPs. But an important part of the role of the Carlton Club was to encourage voter registration. And then in 1834, Peel issues the Tamworth Manifesto, which I mentioned earlier. And this is intended as a rebranding of the Conservative Party for a middle-class audience. And that's when the Conservatives actually adopt the name, the Conservatives. And this shows a recognition that this new group of voters is going to be crucial to Conservative Party success. And therefore, the party needs to appeal to those new voters. And that is very effective for the Conservatives because in 1841, the Conservative Party becomes the first ever opposition party to defeat a government in an election that has a parliamentary majority, and that's the first time that ever happens. Now, when the Tamworth Manifesto is written, this represents, the first time a political party sought to increase their political influence by appealing to a new group of voters. Now, the Tamworth Manifesto, therefore, is in some ways a precursor to the Second and Third Reform Acts, because what we see in the Second and Third Reform Acts is political parties attempting to win new groups of voters in order to increase their political influence. So whether that is in gaining the urban working class voters for the Liberal Party, or whether it's even later gaining female voters for the Conservative Party, this establishes a precedent. So even though the Tamworth Manifesto is not in itself a Reform Act, it is in many ways similar to the later Reform Acts, because it shows that political parties were aware that they needed to adjust their kind of ideology, adjust their commitments to policy in order to win over new voters, and that would strengthen the political influence of that party. So that is the Conservative Party, the Tamworth Manifesto and the Carlton Club. The Whigs were a little bit more slow to react, and in fact they only reacted once they were concerned that Peel would actually win the 1835 election. And in 1835 they therefore formed an agreement in what has become known as the Lichfield House Compact. And in this agreement the Whigs agreed, and the Whigs were mostly from aristocratic backgrounds. Obviously those in the House of Commons were not actually aristocratic, but they were related to aristocratic families. And the Whigs formed an alliance with relative political outsiders. They formed an alliance with radical MPs and also Irish MPs. Now, this again reflected the increasing importance of a majority in the House of Commons after 1832, because the Whigs here were working with people who had quite different political interests to them. But they agreed to work together in order to make sure that they would win a majority. Now, that wouldn't have happened before 1832, because before 1832, a party could govern without a majority. And there was no need to kind of have that formal majority. So they agreed to work together in the Lichfield House Compact. They then formed the Reform Club, which was a club for radical MPs and Whig MPs. And unlike the Tamworth Manifesto, the Reform Club wasn't very good at organising voter registration. It was more a place for political discussion and a place to kind of cement that partnership between the radicals and the Whigs. But the changes to both the Conservative Party and to the Whig Party, which would later become the Liberal Party, show that after 1832, the organisation of parties had become the most important way of getting a majority in the House of Commons and therefore of forming a government. So whereas before 1832 the support of the Crown was the most important factor in forming a government, after 1832 party majority is the most important. And to get a party majority, a majority in the Commons, to get that, party organisation becomes essential. So at the same time, after 1832, you see a decline in the number of independent MPs as MPs become more likely to affiliate themselves to a party, recognising that, a party with a majority is the only group that could rule. So hopefully that reflects for you then the truth of the quote that we looked at right at the beginning of this, which is that the details of the bill in 1832 were less important than the fact and the manner of its passing. Because the fact that a bill had passed despite the opposition of the monarch, and the fact that that bill had passed because of a majority in the House of Commons and the support of the electorate and public opinion, that showed that in future the monarch would not be able to influence government as much as he had done, because the majority was now important than the monarch. And that happened not because of the nature of the bill itself, but because the bill had passed in the face of royal opposition. Similar for the aristocracy, the actual bill seemed to strengthen the power of the aristocracy. When Grey put the bill forward to the House of Commons, he calls it an aristocratic bill. So the bill itself strengthens the aristocracy, but the manner of the bill passing, in the fact that public opinion had forced a change through. The change would not have happened if it weren't for extra parliamentary pressure. So the fact that public opinion had forced a change through in the face of opposition from the House of Lords meant that the foundations for the reduction in the power of the aristocracy were laid. And then finally, in terms of the impact on party organisation, the way that the bill passed showed that a majority in the House of Commons was now the most important factor in political power. And that meant that party organisation was essential after 1832. So hopefully that has completed your notes for the impact of the 1832 Reform Act. These videos keep getting longer. I'm really sorry. We're on 37 minutes. I apologise. Hopefully next one will be a little bit shorter. So next we are going to look at the reasons for the passing of the 1867 Reform Act.